Contrary to Soviet propaganda, the tank battles at Kursk was not the death ride of the panzers, with hundreds of German tanks being destroyed. New research of German battle reports and post-war admissions by Soviet generals clearly shows that tactically and numerically, the Germans won the tank battle, especially around Prokhorovka on July 12th. The Germans came a lot closer to achieving their objectives than previously realized. In January 1943, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and President Franklin D. Roosevelt met at Casablanca in North Africa and agreed that Axis forces could only surrender unconditionally. Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, who did not attend the Casablanca summit, voiced his displeasure from the beginning. Although any hope of Germany winning the war against Russia was lost at Stalingrad in early summer 1943, the German army was still capable of inflicting devastating losses on the Soviet Union if properly led. Roosevelt feared that, in the event of a disastrous summer campaign, Stalin would strike a separate peace with the Germans, leaving the Western Allies to shoulder the full brunt of the German war machine. After Manstein's counterstroke in March 1943 stopped the Soviet winter offensive, inflicting considerable losses, he put forth his proposals for the coming summer offensive. Hitler accepted the plan, which eventually became known as Operation Citadel, but delayed it for 2 months until new heavy tanks were available. Field Marshal Model, who would command the northern part of the pincer attack, cautioned that the plan was painfully obvious and that the Soviets were already preparing deep and strong defensive positions to counter it. Manstein argued that Citadel might have worked in May when Hitler signed the operational order, but now noted that its success was doubtful. The Soviets had excellent intelligence prior to the commencement of Operation Citadel from British intelligence, which was indirectly providing the Soviets with advanced knowledge of the German plans through its intercepts from the German Enigma coding machine. Hitler's delays played right into Soviet hands. Stalin heeded the advice of Marshal Zhukov to postpone a Soviet offensive until after the Germans had bled themselves dry on the Kursk defenses. And those defenses were substantial, with the assistance of 300,000 civilians who dug trenches, constructed fortifications, and placed mines at a density of 5,000 per mile of frontage. The German plan was to use the classic pincer movement, attacking from the base of a bulge with the town of Kursk at its center. Together, the armies from the north and south would meet east of Kursk, trapping the Soviet forces inside the bulge. 9 Soviet infantry armies and 2 tank armies were at risk within the Kursk salient, and any further Soviet offensive action scheduled for the remainder of 1943 would have to be canceled if the Germans were successful. Despite Manstein's concerns about repeated delays, Operation Citadel finally began on July 5th with a short but intense bombardment. In the north, the 9th Army used its infantry divisions to begin the attack with the hope that they would break open the Soviet defenses. Subsequently, the panzer divisions would be deployed to exploit the openings and crush the Soviet reserves out in the open north of Kursk. In the event, German infantry divisions were unable to break through the Soviet defenses as needed, and the panzer divisions became mired in the defensive belts. Not only were the Soviet defenses much stronger than expected, but Hitler's prized Elephant tank destroyers, all assigned to the northern sector, also fell short of expectations. Although their powerful 88mm guns proved deadly to Soviet armor, the 67-ton Elephants were mechanically unreliable and lacked a machine gun for close protection, making them vulnerable to infantry anti-tank units. After several days of bloody fighting, the attack stalled near the town of Ponyari, after the 9th Army had committed its last reserves to the offensive. Model's worn-out 9th Army had advanced barely 10 miles and was still far from breaking into the open. Soviet casualties were heavy, but that did not prevent them from launching an offensive into Model's northern flank on July 12th. From then on, Model was hard-pressed just to contain a Soviet breakthrough, let alone advance. In the south, Manstein, unlike Model, had no illusions about his infantry's capacity to breach the fortified defenses and employed massed armor formations from the outset. The 4th Panzer Army employed its panzer divisions in the opening attack and had more success. A massive bombardment opened the way for Hoth's 4th Panzer Army's advance as it blasted its way through the defenses of the Soviet 1st Tank Army and 6th Guards Army. Over the first 3 days of the offensive, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps did a good job of breaking through 2 of the 3 main lines of defense in front of it, but its progress was hindered by the 3rd and 48th Panzer Corps' failure to provide flank protection. The 3rd Panzer Corps, on the right flank of the SS formations, had to start the offensive by forcing a crossing over the Donets River. Strong Soviet defenses delayed the crossing, and the 3rd Panzer Corps was not able to keep pace with the advance of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps. Despite having the elite Grossdeutschland Panzer Division with over 300 tanks, the 48th Panzer Corps, which was situated on the left flank of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, faltered from the outset. Hard resistance, mines, swampy ground, and mechanical failures that rendered 36 of its new Panthers immobile were all factors that contributed to the delays. This failure by the flanking corps to keep up with the 2nd SS caused the SS Panzers to divert resources to protect their flank instead of pushing north for a quick, decisive breakthrough to Kursk. The pace of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps advance alarmed the Soviets. It forced the Stavka to prematurely commit their strategic reserves to reinforce the southern defenses. The 5th Guards Infantry and 5th Guards Tank Armies from the reserve step front, as well as the 2nd Tank Corps, were rushed forward to blunt the German advance. These formations were commanded by General Konev, who objected to this premature piecemeal commitment of the strategic reserve. These 2 Guard armies were meant to lead the planned counteroffensive after the Germans had exhausted and depleted their units against the Kursk fortifications. Konev's opinion was quickly altered by a personal call from Stalin. By July 9th, the 1st SS Panzer Division spearheads were already at the outskirts of Prokhorovka, the last major line of Soviet defenses. The early commitment of 2 of the reserve armies shows how critical the situation had become around Prokhorovka. The attack by the Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army and several attached corps on July 12th marked the start of the last phase of Operation Citadel. The massed Soviet armor firing on the move charged down the slopes in front of Prokhorovka, with troops from the 9th Guards Airborne Infantry riding on their backs. 520 tanks assaulted the southern outskirts of Prokhorovka, which was being held by the 1st SS Panzer Division, while another 240 tanks were committed against the 2nd SS Panzer Division, southwest of Prokhorovka. The massed Soviet tank formations tried to close the distance between themselves and the German tanks as rapidly as possible to offset the superior firepower and range of the German tank guns. The gun sights and range finding on the Russian tanks were rather crude when compared to the advanced optical systems on German tanks, allowing the Panzers to pick off the Russian tanks at greater ranges. The Russian tactic of closing at high speed disrupted the control and coordination of the Soviet tank formations and further reduced their accuracy. SS Panzer Grenadiers engaged the Soviet infantry at extended range with their MG-34s, then waited for the Soviet tanks to close the distance before attacking them with magnetic anti-tank mines. Despite this, the German after-battle damage report showed that the majority of Russian armor losses were caused by artillery and mines rather than anti-tank hits. Another reason for the high Russian casualty rate was that Russian air power was spread all along the length of the front, dissipating their strength, while the Luftwaffe concentrated their effort on the Prokhorovka area. This gave the Germans local air superiority over the Prokhorovka battlefield, which they exploited to the full. Luftwaffe liaison officers allotted to German ground forces were able to guide the close air support units to carry out pinpoint attacks on the Russian armored columns to devastating effect. Even though it had managed to hold on to most of its ground, the 1st SS Panzer Division was exhausted by the end of the day from having to repel 5 Soviet tank brigades. To its left, the 3rd SS Panzer Division had managed to advance according to plan along the Sel River's northern bank, outflanking Prokhorovka to the northwest. For the Soviets, it was disastrous. In total, the Soviets lost about 650 tanks to the 2nd SS Panzer Corps and lost more ground than they gained. Only 62 tanks had been lost by the 3 divisions of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, and 80% of those could be repaired in a few days. Enraged by the early reports of heavy Soviet losses in the battle, Stalin angrily chastised Rotmistrov, the 5th Guards Tank Army commander, over the phone late on July 12th. He then dispatched Zhukov, who had led the counteroffensive against the German northern pincer, to represent Stavka and take over the coordination of the various armies in the vicinity of Prokhorovka. Simultaneously, a commission was sent to look into the reason for the large losses and how much Rotmistrov and his plans had contributed to the disaster. 2 weeks later, the commission's report was finished and sent to Stalin. At first, Stalin was thinking of dragging Rotmistrov before a military court, which was the prerequisite for the firing squad in the Soviet Union at the time. After several high-ranking generals begged him to reconsider, he finally changed his mind. There was an air of optimism at Field Marshal von Manstein's headquarters on the morning of July 13th. The 3rd Panzer Corps had finally broken through and was coming up on the right flank of the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, with the prospect of surrounding and destroying yet another Russian army, while Manstein's strategic reserve, the 24th Panzer Corps, consisted of 2 panzer divisions, one of which was the elite 5th SS Panzer Division Wiking, was preparing for its move into the front at Prokhorovka for the final push to Kursk. Later that day, the Führer summoned von Manstein to his Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia. Hitler stunned the generals present by ordering the termination of Operation Citadel with immediate effect. Manstein was bitterly disappointed. He argued that his forces were now on the verge of achieving a major breakthrough on the southern side of the salient. As he saw it, they would be halting the offensive just at the moment when victory was in hand. Hitler gave permission for the offensive to continue in the southern salient, but withdrew the 24th Panzer Corps to support the 1st Panzer Army, which was facing mounting pressure further south, ensuring Manstein had no chance of accomplishing his goal. Hitler had been alarmed by the storming of his vaunted Fortress Europa 2 days ago, when powerful Western Allied forces landed on Italian soil. Hitler felt that moving forces from Kursk to Italy was imperative due to the possibility of additional Allied landings. By the 16th, the 2nd SS Panzer Corps had started to redeploy troops to other Eastern Front sectors and the Mediterranean theater. Hitler had run out of time. The Germans gained nothing from the delay in starting Operation Citadel, although it had proven crucial to its failure. The Elephant and Panther tanks had failed to live up to expectations, although the Panther would become the best tank of the war once all its defects had been solved. Only the Tiger tank achieved success during the battle, having come into service sooner than the other 2, allowed the mitigation of its faults, but its low availability meant that its impact on the battle was minimal. The failure of Operation Citadel effectively sealed the fate of the Wehrmacht on the Eastern Front. From then on, the Germans would never again take the initiative, fighting a defensive war of attrition they could never hope to win.
If you liked this video, there are many similar high-quality videos on my channel.